Right. Okay. I think we're live on Instagram also. And yeah, shall we begin then? Good evening, everyone who has joined our live session. Today, we're set for a very engaging and interesting conversation on the rediscovery of unequal exchange by Miavas and Piketty in their much discussed and debated paper, which, using quantitative data, examines the idea of colonial transfers and unequal exchange in the international monetary and trade system. Our speakers today, Dr. Shaira Mazhar and Dr. Sabri Onku, had contributed a wonderful piece in EPW critiquing Neivas and Piketty's reluctance to engage with Marxist and other theorists who had previously, decades before, theorized the idea of unequal exchange and development and its relation to imperialism. And in particular, their reluctance to engage with world systems and dependency theory. And this is the conversation that we'll be having today, and I'm sure it'll be very interesting and an important conversation to have in order to also examine certain disciplinary tendencies in economics at large. Allow me to introduce our speakers for today. Dr. Shaira Mazhar is an economist and associate professor at Bucknell University, Pennsylvania. He is also the host of the weekly show Dialectic at Work on the popular socialist media platform Democracy at Work. And I must also add that he's also a wonderful musician. Dr. Sabri Anku is an economist and researcher who has held research positions previously at the Center for Advanced Financial Research and Learning, which is affiliated with the Reserve Bank of India and the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. He's also a regular contributor to EPW. I think to start off our discussion, both of you start your article by presenting this interesting excerpt from Samuelson's essay, which is titled, the essay itself is titled The Illogic of the Neo-Marxian Doctrine of Unequal Exchange. And Samuelson staunchly refutes this Marxist idea of unequal exchange, arguing that instead comparative advantage, which is very popular in economics and accepted as truth, is one of the very few pieces of statistical logic that economists of all schools understand and agree with. So this is Samuelson's argument in the essay refuting Emmanuel's idea of unequal exchange. Perhaps you both want to begin by briefly going over the debate between the neoclassical idea of international specialization or comparative advantage versus the idea of unequal exchange propounded by Marxists and other economists.
Let me mention something, and then I'll let Sharam to answer your question. The thing that I would like to mention is the following. In neoclassical economics, the word exploitation doesn't exist.
Mhm.
That is the main difference between neoclassical economics and other economic schools of thought, especially Marxism or Marxian economics, if you like. Exploitation plays a central role in the Marxian economic theory, whereas for neoclassicals, it doesn't exist.
Absolutely. Just to add to what Professor Onku said, think about it this way, Jasmine, that the question of value and price has been a central concern for political economists and the debate within political economists for at least 200 years now, 200 to 250 years. And in one shape or the other, that debate obviously manifests itself in the domain of domestic exchange as well as the domain of international exchange. So just briefly for your audiences, David Ricardo, a couple of hundred years ago, had developed the theory of comparative advantage in a world where entire products were produced in countries. So the famous example is that Portugal makes wine and England makes cloth. This is the example that all of us have had to study in our undergraduate classes. And then via this specialization process, each country specializes in the production of the good in which it has a comparative advantage. And lo and behold, this is the best thing that has happened to mankind since McDonald's, right? Now, uh, think about it this way. Um, Soon after World War II, when these newly independent countries won their independence from British, French, or Dutch colonialism, a man by the name of Raoul Prebisch, who was at the UNCLA, the United Nations Commission for Latin America at the time, alongside Hans Singer and Andre Gunder Frank, of course. And these people began to, by the way, these people were trained in the traditional mainstream tradition of economics. And they began to study empirically, I may add, the relations of trade that exist between Latin America, which had at that time been one of the freest country in terms of free trade, and the core countries, i.e., the rich countries, the traditional Western core. And lo and behold, here's what we need to understand. Raoul Prebisch and Hans Singer discovered what was later called the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis or theorem, which demonstrates that the terms of trade, what are the terms of trade? What can I buy for the stuff that I sell you, right? The terms of trade began to decline demonstrably for the poor country. This attribute demonstrates to us that the gains from trade are not equally distributed, so that even if global income goes up as a result of trade, the gains are going to be unequally distributed. Number one. Number two, where does this division of labor come from? For example, why does Kenya produce tea? Why does the Indian and Pakistani Punjab and the Egyptian area around the Nile Delta produce cotton? If we begin to ask these questions, we begin to demonstrate or see, as Frank did, that this division of labor is not an original condition. It is not the destiny of Kenya to make tea, or Sri Lanka, or Ceylon, as it was called back in the day, but rather we begin to demonstrate and analyze and ask the following question: where does this division of labor come from in the first place? That is to say, where does this international specialization, which is the panacea of development for mainstream neoliberal trade theory, where do those international specializations arise from in the first place, which gave birth to this seminal work by Frank and then a bunch of other thinkers that posited the development of underdevelopment, namely the idea that underdevelopment is not destiny, it is not written in stone, it was not created by God, but rather a process of primitive accumulation at the global scale has been at the heart of, as Professor Onku pointed out, class, race, national, and gendered exploitation since the beginning of this economic system. That's what is at stake
Yeah.
here. This is also why, in that quotation that you provided with Professor Samuelson referring to the theory of unequal exchange as the illogical doctrine, neo Marxian
Yeah.
doctrine of unequal exchange, notice the language, right? Why? What is at stake in this particular discussion? Professor Samuelson understands exactly what is at stake in this discussion. Because if we accept the premise that the basis of economic development, what we call capitalist development, is surplus value exploitation by the elites from the workers, and at the global scale in this world economic system, there is that national division of labor that we've inherited from the colonial past. This is why it is imperative for Professor Samuelson and his neoclassical followers to refer to this theory as a doctrine, as an ideology, rather than a scientific fact that explains the real economy and its history as it is. That is what is at stake
And
here.
furthermore, they claim that theirs is science.
Exactly.
Yeah. So everything else is not.
Exactly.
That's the main issue here. Anyway, I don't have much to add to what Shahram said to your first question. Um, I mean, his answer. Well, this is a political game. Neoclassicals hardly ever acknowledge the existence of other schools of economic thought, although they know it.
Let me tell you this
They don't.
story, if I may. My former professor, Stephen Resnick, who was a student of Paul Samuelson, used to tell us a story, and he's also written about this story in his published papers, just to let you know, I'm not making it up. Uh, so Steve used to tell us that at MIT, he used to walk into Paul Samuelson's office, and once Stephen Heimer and Stephen Resnick went to Paul Samuelson's office and asked him, what is there in Marxian theory which is A, correct, A, valid, and B, missing, invisible from neoclassical analysis, right? So Steve Resnick, a graduate student, goes to Paul Samuelson and says, Sir, Professor, what is there in Marxian theory that is A, valid, and B, invisible from neoclassical economics? And Paul Samuelson immediately responded, class exploitation. In other words, as the professor pointed out, they are keenly, acutely aware of this discrepancy, this divergence, this central difference that exists between the two schools of economic thought, basically since 1867, when the old man wrote Capital Volume 1.
Yeah.
Now, coming to the core issue or the argument that was proposed against Piketty and Evans was the fact that they tested out a theory, but they did not cite any of the theorists. They did not engage with any of the theorists. And this is not a one-off issue as well. I think Dr. Shahram, you have also written previously about how the Nobel for Acemoglu was also a Nobel for Paul Baran, who was also not cited in the work. Would you want to elaborate on this tendency of sidelining of Marxist or other thoughts and then appropriating it later on without any acknowledgement?
I'll just say a first few words, and then Professor Onku, obviously, who has much more experience and knowledge than I do, will say a lot more about this. But Jasmine, think about it this way, that the economics profession has been in a state of denial. It has been like a bear that has been in hibernation for at least a century. Especially in the last 5 decades, since the 1970s, the economics profession has basically become a way of celebrating capitalism rather than trying to explain it. And in other words, the ideas that were first developed by Marxist political economists, such as Paul Baran, Sweezy, and later Samir Amin, Emmanuel Wallerstein, Frank, obviously, these ideas were dismissed to the periphery of the profession. Either they were dismissed as sociology, right? Or they were dismissed as some kind of historical intervention, or they were dismissed as simply ideology.
Yeah.
And now, after nearly 4 to 5 decades, the economics profession is beginning to realize. By the way, this is also an interesting observation to note, that empiricism has led them to question their fundamental categories. And hopefully, we'll get a chance to discuss that later as well.
Yeah.
But to return to your question, which deals with the fact of denialism in economics, right? The Marxian tradition, since the 1950s and 60s in particular, has devoted its attention to extending Marx's work. Unlike what neoclassical thinkers believe, Marxism is not just about 1867. It's a alive, developed, and developing way of thinking about the world. But the mainstream, because it was completely not only ignorant about Marx's Capital, but also took great pride in its ignorance. In the economics profession, it's somewhat of a qualification if you can say that, oh, I've never read Marx, ha 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 ha. It's one of those idiotic kind of moments of ignorance And by the way, this is even more serious in the American academy. If you notice, everywhere else, Marxian economics in Japan, in France, in India, in Pakistan, in Turkey, everywhere is taken seriously as a valid mode of thinking and understanding the world, making sense of it. But because mainstream economics, because of the reasons that the professor mentioned, is afraid, is deeply afraid, that's the word, of Marxian economics and its devastating critique of capitalism, it has had to resort to ideological name calling. Number one. Number two, notice the fact that all the major findings of Marxian political economists that pertained to actual real history, right, such as Paul Baran's famous political economy of growth story, you begin to notice that the empirical evidence actually confirms exactly that particular point, right?
Yeah,
Now, in the paper that you mentioned, Mr. Rachimoglu uses this linguistic spin to convert settler mortality into soldier mortality into settler mortality, which is what Baran's story was. Now, what these economists are doing is that they're taking these Marxist theorists' ideas, spinning them into some cozy liberal story, which is comfortable and comforting to the bourgeois way of thinking about the world, and then trying to convince everyone that, oh, look, we found this compelling empirical evidence. The
yeah,
empirical evidence that Nivas and Piketty have, which is, by the way, amazing, I love them for doing that, is a
yeah,
confirmation. Let me say it is a befitting confirmation of what Lenin, Hilferding, Kautsky had written basically 150 years ago. So our problem here is the following, huh? When this working paper was published, I believe on the 8th or 9th of July, it was made available online. There was
nine.
not a mention, I want to say this on the record, there was not a mention of any of the Marxist economists in that particular paper. After Professor Onku and myself and a bunch of other people noticed this particular absence, we posted about it on Twitter because we think this is a very serious business. Not only because of intellectual dishonesty, but also because there is something very serious at stake here. Okay, and after our critique, it's heartening to see that they went online and they changed that particular version and added one particular paragraph to reflect that particular change. I welcome that change, but it would have been nice to just tweet about it and say that thank you very much for pointing that absence out, and we've made that particular change. That would have been very, very nice.
Furthermore, there are still some names missing, like Immanuel Wallerstein is not there, Giovanni Arrighi is not there. Their contributions to this area must be acknowledged in a study like Niemas and Piketty's, right? Because they're, how should I say, adding to what they have been saying. I mean, helping them or providing evidence to what they have been arguing for decades. Well, still, I mean, Frank is there now. Emmanuel is there. Who the Prebisch singer, Ivan Cardoso and Filatello, who are liberals actually, nothing to do with the other ones, but nevertheless, they are also contributors to the dependency theory. But still, I don't see Emmanuel Overseen there or Giovanni Arrighi. They should be. Anyway, Shannon already summarized the situation. Probably, yeah, for example, the article that he wrote about Acemoglu's Nobel Prize, he sent it not to an economics journal, but to a geography journal. Had he written this article for one of those leading economics journals, most likely the person who refereed this paper would reject it in a second. They sent it to the he sent it to the geography journal. And as a matter of coincidence, I happened to be his one of his referees, and I accepted that paper. But a
That's how we
referee,
became friends.
yeah, but we didn't know about it at the time when I refereed your paper, right? Anyway, this is the thing. I mean, Charam cannot send this article to say American Economic Review
No,
and
no
get it
chance.
accepted there. It's impossible.
No
It's,
chance.
and by the way, American Economic Review was established by institutionalists. In the beginning, it was pretty progressive. Now it's all neoliberal.
Yeah.
Uh, that also shows something else, right? Over time, particularly in the United States, the economic profession excluded all other economic schools of thought and only accepts those from sub schools of neoclassical economic school of thought. Uh, this is, and as Sharam said, it's neoclassical economics is about praising capitalism, showing how nicely it works and all that. It doesn't criticize. It doesn't try to understand actually, uh, in an honest way, the problems associated with it. I mean, they identify, of course, problems, but most of those problems are bad regulations. If you improve the regulations, things will get bad. The monopoly is bad. Competition is good. And if the state ensures that the markets are competitive, life will be wonderful, and all that kind of um, arguments that they present, even in the most serious um, works that they publish. This is where we actually, both Sharam and I guess we agree on this, respect Neos and Piketty. They don't act that way. They question. However, acknowledgement is unfortunately is not there yet. Oh, hopefully, but for example, if you remember the title of our article, "An Eclipse of Imperialism," there is a reason for that. They pretend as if it doesn't exist. And
Right.
there's unequal exchanges about imperialism, right? Imperialist accumulation. Not necessarily it's the best theory that explains everything. Even Marxians criticize the theory, or other heterodox non-neoclassical economists criticize the theory. Uh, but nevertheless, um, explains better than neoclassical economics, even in this form. And at the heart of it lies imperialism, right? It doesn't exist in neoclassical's dictionary. Like, for example, Asimov a Nobel-winning paper with Robinson and Simon. What was the other guy? I don't remember the
Simon
name.
Johnson.
Simon Johnson. Yeah. Um, you can find it. Search just articles for fun. There isn't the word imperialism in it. It's not going to. It cannot be, in other words. That's the main reason we said if we are talking about unequal exchange, we should mention imperialism and analyze it. If it doesn't happen, then uh, what you did is not necessarily wrong, but it's not sufficient. Let me put it that way.
Right. Perhaps like picking up from what Dr. Onku was talking about. But before that, I just wanted to also say that the audience listening to us can also send in their questions on Instagram or as YouTube, comments on the live chat, and we can present it to our speakers as well after the discussion. But yeah, so coming back to the question, I think what Dr. Anku was talking about, the fact that the article, I mean, the paper sort of pretends as if imperialism does not exist anymore, that it was a thing of history. In fact, they make a couple of comparisons in terms of equating colonial transfers of the colonial period to private remittances right now from north to south through workers from the south who are working in the global north. And they also make a comparison between the colonial powers and East Asia at present. So would you want to comment on these and how they sort of present imperialism? In fact, I also saw this critique of it somewhere that there was absolutely no mention of the word capitalism in the paper, as a matter of fact. But yeah, would you want to comment on this?
You go ahead, Sarah.
Sure. Absolutely. So I really want your audiences to understand, because there's been a lot of confusion about this particular issue. Some people have approached us and said that, well, isn't it great that finally, some people are beginning to accept that unequal exchange and other Marxian concepts, which we've been talking about for at least 6 decades, 7 decades now, are beginning to be discussed by the mainstream as well, right? Well, the problem with the line of reasoning uh, that we're trying to critique is precisely that. You see, if you read that particular paper, other than deploying the word unequal exchange without credit, I may add, there is not a single mention of what within the international world system is structurally rooted within the logic of capital, which Dr. Onku basically summarized in the first line of this particular discussion. Where does the following condition arise from? How does it happen on a systemic and structural way? Really want you to understand this, right? Because in the domain of, for Capital's reader, for those in your audiences who read Marx's Capital, Marx assumes equal exchange, CMC, when trying to explain class exploitation, right? In other words, why is CMC violated? This is a question that is worthy of, that deserves an answer. How does it happen that something that was worth, I don't know, 5 rupees, you can charge me 25 rupees for that? How the hell does that happen? Asking that simple question is going to lead you to the following answer. There's some kind of monopolizing of this relation. There's some kind of, let's do it, unequal bargaining power between these two particular economic agents. See, I'm trained in the neoclassical tradition. I feel like a real economist
Yeah.
now, right? You understand what I'm saying? There is an unequal exchange which should lead Nivas and Piketty, as it should lead any sensible human being on this planet, to ask the next question: what is the reason for this? What causes unequal exchange? And a little thought will give you the following answer. Oh my God, it has something to do with history, right? It has to do with let's do it, the imperialist relations of power that exist between core and peripheral countries. You realize that Holland is rich because Congo is poor. England is rich because India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh are poor. The causality, there is a correlation. The richness is the cause of the poverty, and the poverty is the cause of the richness. How difficult is that to understand? Between the 10th to the 15th centuries, China and India were the richest economies in the entire world by terms of GDP per capita. Madison has done that kind of historical research. Between the 15th century to the 18th century, the regions that were the richest economies in the world became the poorest regions in the world. This Acemoglu himself has called the reversal of fortunes. And now when you turn around and ask the third world to just respect comparative advantage, Kenya should keep on making tea, Punjab should keep on making cotton using slave labor, and the rest of the world should keep doing what they were doing in the colonial period. Why? Because you see, comparative advantage is such a holy principle. It was revealed to the prophet of neoclassical economics, right? So, in other words, everyone has to follow that particular path, even at the expense of declining terms of trade, current account deficits, etc., etc. The other question that merits an examination is, because, like all these bourgeois economists, they only look at the form. They only look at the appearance of things. So in their mind, a current account surplus between England and India is the same thing as a current account surplus that China has today or Vietnam has today with regards to the USA. That's what happens when you only look at the form and not the essence of things, right? China's current account surplus or Vietnam's current account surplus or whatever pennies Bangladesh gets from selling textiles to the rest of the world is nothing, absolutely nothing compared to the 200 years of stealing, theft, primitive accumulation, genocide conducted by Western imperialists all across the globe. Go to Australia and look at the conditions in which the First Nations of Australia continue to live. Go to America and look at the conditions of the Native Americans. Go to India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, these millions and millions that Fanon called the wretched of the earth. And the proof of imperialism will be right in front of your eyes. You don't need complex econometrics and different strategies to
Yes.
demonstrate that class exploitation, national exploitation, and patriarchy is rooted in the logic of this economic system. And therefore, reform and reformist theories will do absolutely nothing at this particular moment.
Eh, Okay. What
You
can
want
I add
to?
to this more?
Yes, please.
Very nicely summarized. Uh, let's see. Next question.
Okay. Yeah, perhaps again, picking off from what you left off, Dr. said at the end about how perhaps a question on the idea of empirical reality. Again, now this paper obviously generated a lot of debates on social media, and a lot of the arguments that I saw from most of the debates on the other side was that, hey, this paper is testing something empirically, and that's its contribution. Everything else was just theory. This is testing the theory, and this is empirical, and all of that. But for me, the question that came out was wasn't Frank and Lenin and Marx and Wallerstein, I mean, and everybody, when they were theorizing the idea of unequal development and imperialism, wasn't that based on the empirical reality of millions of people around the world? What more empirics? I mean, why are those theories less empirics than quantitative? So, what qualifies as empirics now in economics, and
Uh,
what is the politics? Is it just quantitative data, or yeah, I think you also refer to the idea of quantification in your paper as well. So, would you want to comment on that?
Go.
Okay. I was waiting for Professor to signal
I
me.
was going to say something. One of the
So,
names that we have been talking about, Gundar Frank. I knew Gundar more or less the way I now know Sharam. We have never been together in the same room physically, but now we have been communicating for quite some time. And that was the situation with Gundar also, except that we didn't have these social media, just emails and email groups and all that. We were close friends. Um, Towards the end of his life, he started saying things like, which, of course, for some people were unacceptable, because he was saying that there doesn't exist something called capitalism. There's the world economy. Let's forget about capitalism. Go back to 5,000 years and look at 500-year cycles and all that. Empirics. Hey, how are you going to study a 5,000 years economy and the progression of the 5,000 years of the world economy, building on 500 years cycles, unless you have some data um, to study that? One of the things, for example, I think you mentioned this in one of your questions. Niewas and Piketty claim is that they do something long term, which wasn't done in the past. If so, what was Andre Gunder Frank was doing then with 500 years economic uh, world economy study with 500 years cycles and all that. Um, so it was empirical, of course. Yani. You don't need heavy tools from econometrics to look at the variables of a particular economic system over time. Um, well, of course, there are some issues. I mean, structural changes occur and this and that. Um, it would be nice to have some strong tools, but nevertheless, uh, if your object becomes the tools rather than what you are trying to study, then it starts deviating from the reality, the real world. Yeah, the purpose is somehow changed. Uh, a nice econometric estimation becomes the object or objective. You need to find what they call an independent instrumental variable or generalized method of moments estimation. um, oh, yeah, and those things are not that simple. Actually, you need to learn them hard. You have to work hard to learn them. Actually, however, if you are learning that kind of stuff, you forget learning about history. Well, you don't have time for that when you are doing. Anyway, let me give it back to Sharam. This is what
Yeah.
all that.
I just wanted to say that with regards to this empiricist fetish in economics, right? Um, a long time ago, I came from a physics and math background, and for anyone who studied physics or math at the highest level, frankly speaking, the mathematics that is deployed by economists is laughable, right? Because the idea that a Lagrangian function can be used to maximize my preferences and my pleasure and pain from consuming an underwear versus a cup of coffee is a laughable and idiotic idea to begin with. Number one. Number two, a man by the name of Hegel, right? Because another problem with mainstream economics is that not only has it forgotten its founding fathers, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, etc., it's also oblivious to the discipline of philosophy, right? And economic reasoning within philosophy. If you notice, the greatest minds of the past, Schumpeter, Adam Smith, Keynes, etc., they had a very, even if they were from opposing sides of the spectrum, they had a very complex and developed understanding of philosophy. Why is that important? Why? Because, well, think about it. A man by the name of Hegel had pointed out to us 50, 60 years before Karl Marx was even born. He wrote this book in 1802, I believe, which is called The Science of Logic, in which, Jasmine, Hegel pointed out the following: you cannot measure something for which a concept does not exist. For example, you cannot use joules unless you have the concept of heat, right? You need the conceptual arsenal of the theory of thermodynamics and heat to really understand that joule is a relevant category to measure this particular thing in. In other words, what am I trying to say? Our measure, what we measure and how we measure it, is not neutral to what qualities we've identified and what categories we're playing with. How we categorize data, what classifications we use to make sense of those data points, is going to have an impact on what we observe. You see what I'm saying? If for example, let's say that a friend of yours had yellow eyes, high fever, etc., etc., and I said that this person suffers from lizard disease, that's the category that I use, and I try to measure how many lizards come in his dreams, etc., etc. That would be a stupid and idiotic measure, because any scientifically inclined person will point out, check out his liver, and there is a disease called jaundice that is creating this particular problem. Similarly, the category of unequal exchange, which Mr. Nivas and Piketty claim to be measuring, did not ever exist in human thought until Raoul Prebisch, Hans Singer, Emmanuel Wallerstein, Ariri, Samir Amin, all the rest of it, came up with these ideas, right? It would be as if we're trying to come up with measures of, compare it with physics, for example. Could anyone have argued that we can measure magnetism, or we can talk about, I don't know, the force of gravity and how much it's accelerating without mentioning the name Newton? Is that a possibility? Would it be acceptable to any physicist if I said that I discovered Hawking's radiation and I don't talk about Stephen Hawking? How would physicists feel about that? Not only is it intellectually dishonest, people would point out, how the hell can you measure something that hasn't been theorized in the first instance, right? So to understand this particular point, I only want your audiences to ask the following question. Number one, what is being measured, right? I'm all for measurement. I'm sold to the idea that a science should have an empirical basis. But to turn the idea around and to say that we don't do any theory, we don't have any opinions or philosophy, we just look at the data and we make, how the hell can you make sense of the data if you don't theorize and classify the information in a particular, how do you do that? If I just threw a set of random numbers at you and I said, make sense of it, how the hell are you going to make sense of it? You're going to say, well, this refers to unemployment, and you're going to have to provide me definitions of those concepts. You would fail a undergraduate student if he just or she just threw some random econometric statistical averages at you and said, make sense of it yourself. You would fail that particular student, would you not? So the entire debate is not about, oh, we have these lovely techniques and look at the T statistic, it's looking so beautiful. It's none of that. The aim of economics was, is, and should be A, to make sense of the world, and B, to change it for the better. Or, as the old man said, the philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think combining perhaps 2 points from Niavas and Piketty. One is that they provide some interesting counterfactual simulations of what would have happened if there were no colonial transfers. And interestingly, again, they use, I think they also mentioned somewhere in their paper that they use the more neutral term colonial transfers instead of
Theft.
extraction. Yeah. So yeah, so they offer some counterfactual simulations of how transfers or how current account and of that would have looked like in the absence of some of these colonial extractions. And second, they also offer some policy suggestions on how this can be rectified, how changes should be made in the international monetary system, certain taxes and things like that. So, would you want to comment on both of these aspects that the paper puts forward?
Well, let me mention one thing before leaving it back to Sharon. Uh, all these reform proposals that they make, these are lovely. I mean, I make similar proposals myself. And I have nothing against such reformist proposals, but uh, if you if you don't recognize the fact that this is an imperialist accumulation system, well, how are you going to improve it unless you eliminate this exploitation, interstatal exploitation, as well as class exploitation that exists by simple reforms? What I like about reformist proposals is that they destabilize the system. Right, and as a result, those revolutionaries are helped by the reformists because of that. Furthermore, revolutionaries also help reformists because we established a credible threat to the system. Well, how credible it is these days, it's questionable, of course, but because of a threat, they can push forward their reformist agendas, right? So, in that regard, it's nice that they made those reformist proposals, but I have doubts that those reforms would alleviate the problem that they identified in the title of their paper, Unequal Exchange. It will continue even after those. I mean, that's what I'm going to say. So, Sharon.
Absolutely, absolutely. Just to add to what the professor said, Jasmine, just think about the following. The solutions that we propose to something have to have some degree of connection, logically speaking, with the problem that we're presenting, right? Think about the following. For example, if we were having this conversation in the year 1843, and we came up with some really robust empirical evidence that slaves had a terrible life in the southern states of America. And now Mr. Piketty was one of the panelists, and a Marxist economist, let's say Prabhat Patnaik, was on the other side. And we asked these two great gentlemen to present their perspective on this particular issue. And Mr. Piketty said, look, I've done this really interesting simulation, right? And my simulation shows that if we tax them by 2.5%, the slave masters are going to have more of that ointment that we need to apply to the backs of the slaves who've been, whipped an hour and a half ago, right? Clearly, any sensible human being would point out, how about the idea of abolishing slavery? What is that? Is that a good policy proposal? Is that on the cards? Is that available on the menu or not? Right? Similarly, when you acknowledge and write an entire paper entitled Unequal Exchange, right? And then obviously unequal exchange because exists because of unequal relations of power, political power. What should be the solution? Ah, taxes. Beautiful. How does this follow? How do you do this? I mean, step one, the problem is unequal power and unequal exchange. The problem is imperialism. Step two, let's reform it. Are you seriously? Let's do another one. In Capital in the 21st Century, by the way, that book is neither about capital nor about the, you understand, it's just about data on income inequality, where that famous um, G greater than R greater than G equation is supposed to explain everything in the world, right? Notice again, the title is the title is drawn from a book written by Karl Heinrich Marx in 1867. You add the timeline 21st century, write this book about income inequality that ends with the words 2.5 tax. Amazing. Wow. Isn't that amazing? Think about it. This shows an amnesia for the real political process that goes into policy making. 60, 70 years ago, in the 1940s, for example, people can look this up. In the time of Franklin D. Roosevelt, the highest income tax bracket in the US was 97%. Basically, if you made more than a certain amount, you didn't make more than that amount, right? What happened? As soon as the ruling classes could regather, reorganize themselves, they pursued the path of neoliberalism, abandoned the working class, social security, unemployment benefits out of the window, etc., etc. In other words, this is a political problem, right? In other words, if you define the problem in terms of unequal exchange, the policy then cannot be let's tax everyone. The policy has to be get rid of the system of oppression, the system of class, national, and gendered oppression called capitalism that has been horrifying, that is a horror story since 1850. Unite the many to fight the few. Why is this not a proposal on the table? Consider the following for it. I'll give you a simulation of my own. Consider the following simulation. Consider the fact that the workers of Bangladesh, the workers of India, the workers of Pakistan, the workers of Mexico, the workers of Brazil, the workers of Turkey, so on and so forth, get together, form, I don't know, an international working class alliance, as they did throughout history in the 1920s as well. A man by the name of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin held a conference of the people of the East in the Soviet Union. And thereafter, the workers, the unions of these poor countries come together and say, look, as long as we continue to fight this fight in our national contexts, the lead companies located in the global north, such as H&M, such as Zara, such as Walmart, such as Apple, such as Microsoft, Nvidia, etc., are going to continue to hyper exploit our workers, right? Why? Because they can make Indian workers fight against Pakistani workers, against Bangladeshi, against Mexican, etc. This is a race to the bottom. So this is my simulation, and I want your audiences to enjoy this simulation for a second, right? Let the workers of the world unite and abolish this imperialist economic and political system once and for all, so that we do not have to deal with the problem of slavery in the first place. In 1843, if we were having this conversation, if someone said the abolition of slavery is a valid policy proposal, that person would be considered crazy. right? Well, thankfully, a man called Abraham Lincoln was that insane person who had precisely those kinds of insane ideas. And by the way, Marx loved him for that.
Yeah. Anyway,
So this can be a final question, and after that, we'll be taking audience questions again. So if there are people who want to ask, please feel free to ask on Instagram and YouTube. But yeah, maybe we can end off by thinking about what this paper now means. Sorry? Yeah, what this paper means for mainstream economics. What this and perhaps other papers also, the recent Nobel and things like that. So, does it mean that neoclassical economics is finally acknowledging its limits and is willing to change itself? Or does it mean that it's just pacifying critique by accepting whatever is palatable to them? So, what does this mean for economics as a discipline as well?
well, let me mention the following. Neoclassical economists are not worried about criticisms from their own ranks. Like, for example, Amartya Sen, for example, Thaler, behavioral economics. Eventually, they become subfields of neoclassical economics and somehow incorporated into it. And they don't turn into anything radical. Um, well, another thing is that if you start becoming, or no, if you radicalize yourself, if you become a radical, you cannot continue to collect the benefits of the establishment. You cannot continue being a professor at Stanford or I don't know, MIT or Chicago or no, you cannot say two bad things about capitalism, right? So given the problems, such criticisms are important and welcome. I mean, no one says that behavioral economics is bad. It shouldn't have happened, or it shouldn't have been initiated by some psychologists or anything like that. But it was absorbed into the mainstream and didn't turn into something radical. Most likely. This work on unequal exchange by Neos and Piketty uh, will not lead to a radical change in the economics profession, neoclassical. Um, uh, Furthermore, although they are using the concept, in the end, what they are proposing is nothing radical, simple reforms, right? I think they can continue living in this. If I understand that Niamas is a student of Piketty, and Piketty is well respected. One of his students, Gabriel Zuckman, is currently at UC Berkeley, most likely. Nieves will end up, if he is a PhD student of Piketty, which I don't know, but I guess that is the case, he will end up at a university like that, being a student of respected professor Piketty. It's a nice thing, of course, but nevertheless, it wouldn't make a serious dent in neoclassical economics. In neoclassical school of thought. Let me put it that way. That's my view.
Absolutely.
And as an,
Absolutely. Let me just add that um, neoclassical economics, as it's called, has been in a state of crisis for a very long time, right? Because the real world has constantly rebelled against its founding dogmas and ideologies, right? That's the first thing. None of the uh, premises of this particular ideology, that humans are rational, calculating, Lagrangian maximizing agents who maximize utility preferences and all the rest of it, right? So that vulgarity, as it's called, Marx referred to this kind of way of thinking as vulgar economics. and I tend to agree with that way of thinking. It is vulgar. Vulgar economics has gone in a particular direction in the last 4 to 5 decades. If you look at the Nobel Prizes in the last 3 to 5 years, with, for example, Mr. Abhijit Banerjee and Duflo being given the prize 3 years ago, maybe. What was that prize given for, right? If I may ask. That prize was not given for economics. That prize was given for commitment to a method, namely RCTs, right? Random control trials. Sounds like a real scientist, right? As if we're sitting in a lab with white coats performing these experiments on human beings, right? Think about the way what does one have to uh, what does it say about one's approach to economics and the world and why one is doing economics, right? So mainstream economics in the last decade to decade and a half has gone in this particular direction where they're no longer committed to questions per se, but rather to a method. And whatever can be asked within that method, by the way, there are extremely stupid questions out there which you can Google, for which millions of dollars of funding has been given to discover whether uh, if the people of Congo have more doctors in a village, does that improve their health or not? My 9-year-old could have told you that without $1 million, that if the people of Congo have more doctors per capita, their health outcomes would improve, right? You don't need to. So whatever can be demonstrated using the RCT method is fairly obvious, and my grandmother could have told you that in advance without spending $1 million, right? And all the interesting questions which pertain to what economics should be like, how the real world is working, how capitalism works, why does the stock market go up when a bad jobs report is released in the USA, right? Why is there an inversal? Why does the stock market enjoy it so much when workers lose their jobs? You can literally just look it up in the last 4 to 5 days. Why does that happen? So, all of these curious questions that pertain to actually thinking about the philosophy and history of economics have been excluded. All that we're doing now is RCTs. We design treatment and control groups as if thinking about economics is no different from understanding how your car works or a COVID vaccine works, right? So there's a fundamental problem with the way these people approach the problem. Number one. Number two, with regards to your question, no, I am not optimistic about the future of neoclassical economics, for the simple reason that a discipline which prides itself in ignorance of its founding fathers, right? When I talk to my neoclassical friends and tell them, have you read The Wealth of Nations? They're like, what wealth? What is off? What is nations? Who is Adam? Who is Smith? Right? Who is David? Who is Ricardo? Who is Karl Marx? Who is Keynes? They have no clue. They're completely clueless. They've never read the works of the founding fathers. And what's the claim? We don't need to do that. We can just do econometrics these days and figure it out all ourselves. Well, congratulations. Econometrics as a way, this is a disservice to statistical reasoning as well, right? To try to argue that this complex web of life, as Jason Moore has called it, can be reduced to a set of simple variables. How the hell do you know which variables are more important than the other? You claim that we have all of these right-hand side variables, and then we can rank them in accordance with which one is more important. How the hell did you do that? Did you know all the variables in advance? Did you know which specification to use? Well, I just got the good T statistic, and that was a good publication. Congratulations. So the entire neoclassical system of thought and incentives, to use their own parlance, is messed up. It's messed up. Neoclassical economics has no resolution, not even a hint. By the way, have you ever thought about the following question? Why did business owners in the 1970s and 80s abandon the economics department and say that we're going to set up our own business school, right? They're discussing the same things, but they realized that economics as a discipline is absolutely useless even from the standpoint of the capitalists. That's why they decided to establish the business school, where real stuff like marketing and HR and finance and all of this stuff, which is actually, going to explain the real economy, is studied. I do this thought experiment with my students, for example. I tell them that, well, you've studied neoclassical economics, and imagine that 4 years from now, these are undergraduate students, imagine that 4 years from now, you're interviewing with Mark Zuckerberg at Meta, and he asks you, sir or madam, what is your plan for Meta in the next 5 years? And you point out that, look, I learned that P equals MC is the best possible world, and I want Meta to become perfectly competitive. What would Mark Zuckerberg say to you at that point? They would say, thank you very much. Thank you for your services. Please go and repeat this dogma in front of some economist, which looks great on the board, right? Real businesses are premised, designed to pursue monopolistic power, right? And a theory that has absolutely no conception of that. Just one final thing, huh? Neoclassical economics is like trying to begin with a unicorn and then trying to explain the real horse, right? You say something about perfect competition. Oh my God, this is so beautiful. And then the real world is derived as an imperfection from that perfect world. It's like trying to explain how the horse runs by looking at a unicorn first and then saying, oh my God, this horse is terrible. So, in other words, Marxian economics begins in the opposite way. We use empirical sciences, we use advanced empirical methods as well as AI and all the rest of it. That's not the question here. Every scientist, every social scientist is going to use empirical methods. It's about how you measure them, how you come up with them, and how, what kind of questions you want to ask and what interventions you want to see in the world. If you're satisfied, if you're content with the poverty and misery of millions of people and you're okay with publishing papers that say 2.5% taxation, good for you. We're on different sides of this particular spectrum in that case.
Jai, thanks so much, Dr. Asar and Dr. Ramko, for that wonderful discussion. I think we'll just briefly take some questions that came from the audience. Firstly, so I'm just reading out the question. On a different note, unless theories and philosophies translate to data, how can reform or revolution happen? Can use of empiricist data be popularized, subverted for subaltern reasons or purposes?
Absolutely, we should. We must deploy every particular method that we can. We're not purists in terms of this method is better than that method, or the identification strategy has to be difference and differences, all of that. I mean, as long as a theory is well developed, it has evidence for it. By the way, Thomas Piketty and Nivas did not do any econometrics either. It's just simple averaging, which is good enough, by the way. Anything that can be demonstrated just looking at it using your eyeballs will also be confirmed using t-statistics and regressions and all the rest of it that the econometrics profession likes. So we're not against empirically measuring things. That's not the point here. Our argument was that Nivas and Piketty are too hesitant to accept the fact that they've measured categories which were developed by Marxist thinkers, right? Just as, for example, if I did an experiment in my room over here, I dropped this phone from the sky and I calculated 9.8 meters per second per second, I would say, excellent job, Sir Isaac Newton, you were right, right? Similarly, my expectation, I don't think it's much of an expectation. I think that Samir Amin, Emmanuel Wallerstein, Andre Gunder Frank deserve a mention, just a little mention, for the amazing work that these father figures of Marxian economics did. They devoted their lives, despite the fact that they were treated with hostility, by this particular profession. They deserve, at the very least, to be reinstated to their proper position in this field, which is as the greatest minds that this particular field has produced. Paul Sweezy, Paul Baran, Samir Amin, Emmanuel Wallerstein. These are giant intellectuals of economic history and thought that this profession has treated with disdain because of its ideological commitment to a dying parasitic system.
Yeah. As I said, Frank and I, Hendrik and then Frank and I knew each other, and we used to exchange ideas and communicate almost every week, especially towards the end of his life. Uh, he once wrote a biography in which he said that my entire career was to have no career at all, because no university was going to accept him as a. Actually, initially he was at uh, Michigan, if I'm not wrong. He worked there for 5 years, and after that, he started living like yeah, what's the word for that? Middle Ages scientists who used to travel from one country to another to continue their lives. That's what he was doing actually. Sometimes in Chile, other times in somewhere in Europe, then somewhere in Asia, and all. Mm, uh, that's how the economics profession treated them. The same thing is true for today too, right? Most of the non-neoclassical economists are in departments like sociology and geography. And what was it, David Harvey, for example? What department was he in? In geography, right?
Yes.
Uh, he's an important Marxian economist, actually, working in the geography department. Uh, so excluded from the economics departments. These important contributors are both the ones who passed away and the current ones. So, like for example, Sharam, uh, he's in a liberal arts college. But with his views, he cannot become a professor at a mainstream university. It's impossible. I mean, like he's not going to be a professor at UC Berkeley, for example. Even if he wanted, they're not going to accept him. I tell you that. That's for sure.
Especially not after this
Most of
interview.
the whatever, but let me tell you this. I mean, uh, d- d- all the radical economists are. Um, uh, uh, Most of them are liberal in liberal art colleges, and if you like Michael Perelman, for example, Chico, um, Michael Perelman couldn't have found a job in any of those respected Ivy League university economic departments. No one would have hired him. Chico hired him, and he became a professor there. Um, it's, uh, it's too dangerous to be a radical in this economic profession. That's one of the reasons why neoclassicals try to avoid appearing radical also. Because if you appear too radical, they are going to kick you out.
Right. I think perhaps we can also wrap up unless you have any final comments from your end.
I just wanted to thank you, Jasmine, as well as the Economic and Political Weekly, and of course, Professor Ronku, who's been very, very kind. He's the one who has been mentoring both me, myself, on this particular issue in terms of obviously how to think about this particular issue, and we're all benefiting from his experience and knowledge and wisdom. So I really want to thank him personally, publicly, as well as Economic and Political Weekly for giving us this opportunity to present our views. Thank you.
Uh, Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you, for this wonderful conversation. In fact, I think we've spoken for over, I mean, almost or slightly over an hour. And, but I mean, it did not feel so. It was such a lovely conversation to listen to. And I think it'll be an important conversation for other listeners as well, and especially those students who are learning economics and other practitioners of economics. Our colleague who's listening has also highlighted that it's a matter of honor for EPW that Andre Gunda Frank, he was also a regular contributor at EPW.
Yeah,
Uh,
indeed. One of my articles in EPW was written in memory of Gundar. This I used a concept from him, economic genocide. to explain what is happening in Argentina and Turkey in these days with Milei in Argentina and Şimşek in Turkey, pretty much using more or less the same tools to implement in their countries, coming from crisis and all that, and squeezing the labor. And Gundar called it economic genocide. So I adopted this term and used the term in my EPW article, as you might remember. I have an article like that with that name in the title.
Yeah, thanks so much again to both speakers. It was lovely listening to you, and thank you so much to the audience who's also listened to us. And I hope you also found this conversation important and enlightening to you as well. Thanks so much, everyone. I think maybe we can wait for the live stream to end.